In 1468, in a dim stone room beneath a parish church in Rouen, France, a 17-year-old girl was forced to stand naked before three men she had never met. They were not soldiers, not criminals, not executioners, they were priests. And they had one job: to determine whether this girl was still a virgin. Not because she had committed a crime, not because she had been accused of anything violent, but because a man, her betrothed, had claimed on their wedding night that she had already been used. That single accusation, just words, was enough to drag this girl out of her bed, strip her of her clothing, and subject her to one of the most humiliating rituals the medieval church ever sanctioned. And here's the worst part. What they did to check was based on absolutely nothing. No medicine, no anatomy, no science of any kind. Just superstition, theology, and control. This is the story of how the most powerful institution in the Western world, the Catholic Church, appointed itself the gatekeeper of women's bodies, how it designed rituals, invented tests, and wrote entire manuals, all to answer one question it had no business asking. And what happened to the women who failed? That's where it gets truly dark. Act 1. Why the Church cared so much. Before we get into the tests themselves, you need to understand why virginity became the Church's obsession. Because it wasn't always this way. In early Rome, in pre-Christian tribal Europe, in most of the ancient world, virginity was acknowledged, sure, but it wasn't a theological weapon. It was a family concern, a social expectation, a preference, maybe. But the Church turned it into something far more dangerous. It turned it into a spiritual verdict. Starting as early as the 4th century, church fathers like Saint Augustine and Saint Jerome began weaving virginity into the very fabric of salvation. Augustine called it the first gift of sanctity. Jerome went even further. He ranked human beings on a spiritual hierarchy, and at the very top, virgins, not saints, not martyrs. Virgins. To Jerome, a woman who lost her virginity outside of sanctioned marriage wasn't just socially stained, she was spiritually fallen, damaged in the eyes of God, and no amount of prayer, penance, or good works could fully undo it. This idea that a woman's body was a reflection of her soul became doctrine. Not official doctrine, but something more powerful. Cultural doctrine, the kind that seeps into every village, every courtroom, every marriage bed across an entire continent. And once that belief took hold, someone had to enforce it. Enter the Church.
Act 2. The Inspections.
Now, let's talk about what they actually did. Because the medieval church didn't just ask a woman if she was a virgin. That would have been too simple, too trusting. And trust, especially toward women, was not something the church was known for. So they tested her. And the tests fell into roughly 3 categories, each more disturbing than the last. Test 1. The physical inspection. This was the most direct and the most degrading. A woman accused of not being a virgin would be brought before a panel, usually consisting of midwives appointed by the church and sometimes clergymen themselves. She would be stripped, laid down, and physically examined. What were they looking for? The hymen. Now, here's what makes this truly grotesque. The medieval church had no accurate understandings of female anatomy. None. They believed the hymen was a sealed membrane that, once broken, could never be restored. They believed it was always present in a virgin and always absent in a non-virgin. We know today that this is completely, medically false. The hymen varies enormously from woman to woman. It can be stretched or torn from horseback riding, physical labor, even normal movement. Some women are born without one entirely. But in the medieval world, that nuance didn't exist. So these midwives, or worse, these priests, would conduct an inspection based on a fantasy of anatomy. And their verdict? Final. If they said you were a virgin, you were saved. If they said you weren't, God help you. Test 2. The urine test. This one sounds almost absurd until you realize people's lives depended on it. Several medieval medical and theological texts, including writings attributed to Albertus Magnus and the widely circulated Secreta Mulierum, Secrets of Women, outlined a urine-based virginity test. Here's how it worked. The woman was made to drink a specific concoction, sometimes water mixed with ground-up flowers, sometimes ale mixed with herbs. Then, her urine was collected and examined. If she urinated quickly and the urine was clear, virgin. If she urinated slowly or the urine was cloudy, not a virgin. That's it. That was the science. A woman's entire future, her marriage, her social standing, her safety, could hinge on how fast she peed. And the church didn't question it because it was written in Latin by men with titles, and that was enough. Test 3. The Fumigation Test. This is the one that sounds like it belongs in a horror novel. The woman would be made to sit or crouch over a pot of burning herbs, often coal mixed with dock flowers or other aromatics. The smoke would rise up toward her body. The theory? If the woman was a virgin, her body was sealed and the smoke would have no effect on her. But if she was not a virgin, if her body had been opened, the smoke would enter her, travel upward, and she would taste the herbs in her mouth, or she would cough, or her eyes would water. Any physical reaction at all was taken as proof that she had been with a man. Think about that. A woman, terrified, humiliated, crouched over burning coals, coughs from the smoke, and that cough destroys her life. That was considered justice.
Act 3. Who ordered these tests?
You might be wondering, was this fringe? Was this just some backwater village nonsense that the church quietly tolerated? No. Virginity testing was embedded in canon law. It was referenced in ecclesiastical court proceedings. It was discussed, seriously formally, by bishops, theologians, and papal advisors. The Decretum Gratiani, one of the most important collections of church law compiled around 1140, included provisions about marriage disputes in which a husband could claim his wife was not a virgin at the time of marriage. These disputes went to church courts, and those courts had the authority to order inspections. In many regions of medieval Europe, France, England, the Italian states, the Iberian Peninsula, these inspections were not optional, they were compelled. A woman could not refuse. To refuse was to confess. And the people conducting them, midwives, nuns, occasionally physicians, were acting under church authority. They filed reports. They gave sworn testimony. They used the language of the sacred to describe what was, in reality, an act of violation. Act 4. What happened when she failed? Now we arrive at the part of this story that haunts, because the test was never really about truth, it was about consequences. And the consequences for a woman found to be not a virgin were catastrophic. Consequence 1. The marriage was annulled. If a husband brought a claim and the church's test supported it, the marriage could be declared null and void, not divorced, erased, as though it never happened. The woman was sent back to her family, if her family would take her. Often, they wouldn't, because now she carried a label worse than poverty, worse than illness. She was damaged goods, publicly, officially, spiritually. Consequence 2. She was sent to a convent, against her will. In many cases, a woman who failed a virginity test was placed in a convent, not out of devotion, not out of choice, out of punishment. These weren't the peaceful abbeys of Hollywood imagination. For a disgraced woman, the convent was a prison, a place to spend the rest of her life in silence, labor, and prayer for forgiveness for a sin she may never have committed. Some of these women were teenagers. Consequence 3. Public penance and humiliation. In parts of medieval France and England, women found guilty of lost virginity were subjected to public penance rituals. They were made to walk barefoot through town, sometimes in plain white garments, sometimes with their hair shorn, a visible mark of shame. The community was meant to watch, to learn, to internalize the lesson. This is what happens when a woman's body does not meet the Church's standard. Consequence 4. In extreme cases. Death. This was rarer, but it happened, particularly in cases where virginity was tied to accusations of fraud, witchcraft, or heresy. If a woman had been promised as a virgin, in a marriage contract, in a religious vow, and the Church determined she was not, it could be framed as deception against God. And deception against God in the medieval world was no small charge. In some documented cases, women were executed, not directly for failing the test, but for the accusations the failure made possible. The test was the domino. Everything else fell after. Act 5. The women who fought back. Now, and I think this is important, not every woman went quietly. There are records, scattered but powerful, of women who challenged the process. In the court documents of 15th century England, there's a case of a woman named Eleanor, last name lost to time, who, when ordered to undergo an inspection after her husband's accusation, demanded that he be inspected too. She argued before the ecclesiastical court that if her body was subject to scrutiny, so should his. The court refused, obviously. But the fact that her protest was recorded, written down by the very clerks who served the system, tells us something. It tells us that even in the darkest corridors of institutional control, resistance existed. There were also midwives who quietly subverted the system. Some are documented as having declared women virgins regardless of what they found, because they understood the anatomy better than the priests, and they knew the test was a lie. These women, the examiners who chose mercy, don't have monuments. They don't have feast days, but they saved lives. Act 6, the long shadow. You might be sitting there thinking, that was the medieval period, brutal, ignorant, long gone. But here's what's uncomfortable. Virginity testing didn't die in the Middle Ages. The World Health Organization, in a statement issued as recently as 2018, called for a global ban on virginity testing because it is still practiced in at least 20 countries around the world. The methods have barely changed. The shame hasn't changed at all. And the fundamental premise that a woman's worth can be determined by the state of a membrane, that premise was built in the period we just discussed. It was sanctified by the institution we just described. And it was exported through colonialism, through legal tradition, through religious influence into the modern world. The medieval church didn't just test women, it created a framework of control that outlived it by centuries. Epilogue. So the next time someone calls the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, and you roll your eyes, because yes, there was art, there was innovation, there were cathedrals that touched the sky. Remember that in those same centuries, a girl could be pulled from her home, stripped before strangers, subjected to a test with no scientific basis, and destroyed, socially, spiritually, and physically, because a man said 4 words: she was not pure. And the most powerful institution on earth said, let us check. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think, subscribe to Dust and Dynasty. We don't just tell history, we tell the parts they left out of the textbook. I'll see you in the next one.